Hi everyone, welcome to Module 4. In this module, we're going to talk in a lot of depth about primates. Some of you might be wondering though, what is a primate anyway? So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll have a better idea about what primates are, why anthropologists even study them, and the relationship they have to you and all humans. So without further ado, let's begin. Let's start with the obvious question. Why are we, in a course about humans, spending time on non-human primates? Well, anthropologists study primates because they're our closest living relatives. In the 18th century, Carl von Linné, also known as Linnaeus, placed humans in the taxonomic order primates, along with monkeys and apes. Modern molecular biology has actually backed this up. Humans and chimps share somewhere between 97 and 99% of their DNA, which is a lot. So when we look at primates, we're not just looking at like cute animals. We're actually looking at living clues about how our own bodies evolved, how our brains and our social behaviors developed, and how we as humans fit into this larger world of animals. Before diving into a lot of the specifics and thinking about primate diversity, I want to just define the study of primates or primatology. So primatology, like I said, the scientific study of primate behavior, as well as primate biology, evolution, and taxonomy, is one of the ways that anthropology uses scientific approaches to understand human variation and human origins. It also reminds us that being human, quote unquote, is not just about culture and symbolism. It's also about being a particular kind of animal with particular evolutionary histories. Primatologists use three main research approaches to study primates, and they map onto broader anthropological methods. The first way that primatologists go about doing their work is through field studies. And this is basically just observing primates in their natural habitats. So that could be a forest, a savanna, in the mountains, you name it. This is where researchers watch to learn how primates move, how they eat, how they socialize, and how they respond to predators in the wild. Then, in a more controlled setting, there are laboratory studies. These are really controlled environments where scientists can design experiments, like testing primate learning or primate memory, or even problem solving. And they're controlled because typically all the variables that exist out in the wild would make it really difficult to test just one thing, like learning or memory. In a lab, this can be done much more easily because you can control all the other variables that might be impacting the results of your experiment on primate learning. So in addition to field studies and laboratory studies, there are also semi-free ranging studies. These typically happen in settings like large enclosures or sometimes on islands where primates can move about more freely than in a laboratory, but where researchers are still going to have more access and control than if they were totally in the wild. All three of these settings and all three of these types of studies, they are scientific approaches that help us build testable explanations for primate behavior. And by extension, this helps us start to understand human behavior as well. So already you can see how this lecture is feeding directly into some of the outcomes of our course. You're seeing right now how anthropologists use scientific observation and experimentation to understand human origins and human diversity. Let's move on. how to define a primate. So, defining primate is a little bit tricky because there isn't just one defining trait. Instead, primates are usually described by a set of shared tendencies, kind of like a package deal, like it says on the screen. So, I just want to walk through the big ones with you. These are grasping and prehensile capability, which we'll talk about in more detail, mobility and manipulation, senses and dentition, or teeth, and life history and brain size. So let's begin at the beginning with grasping and prehensile capability. So many primates are arboreal, meaning that they live in trees. To move safely in that three-dimensional, complicated environment, they evolved really impressive prehensile capability, which is essentially the ability to grasp things, branches, trunks of trees, and so on, with their hands, their feet, and sometimes, as pictured on the slide, their tails. So you can think of, in the textbook that you read for this module, the Exploring Our World textbook, there's a picture of a red howler monkey in that chapter. And it's wrapping its tail around a branch while also using its hands and its feet. So that tail, that prehensile tail, effectively becomes like a fifth limb for primates. Another key feature of primates is opposability, and that's the ability to move the thumb or big toe to touch the other digits on the hand or the foot. It gives primates this opposability gives primates a powerful precision grip for branches, as well as for food, tools, and if we extend this to humans, things like smartphones and technology. You can probably see then how this, matters for humans. Our opposable thumbs and our fine motor control are part of what allows us to write, to type, even to do things like perform surgery and build skyscrapers. And this is something that is shared with primates and is a key feature of them. Primates have a generalized skeletal structure, which is really helpful for them in terms of mobility and their ability to manipulate objects. So when I say generalized skeletal structure, what do I mean? Essentially, what I mean is that their joints, their limbs, and their torso are all relatively flexible, and they're not hyper-specialized for just one kind of movement. So, for example, bones in the hands and feet of primates, they're separate and they're mobile. This increases primates' range of motion as well as the precision that they have. So primates also typically have flat fingernails instead of claws, and their hands have these really sensitive fingertip pads or dermal ridges that are essentially there just to help them detect textures and to help them manipulate objects. If you look at the figure of the orangutan skeleton that's in the chapter in your textbook on primates, you can see how the shoulder joints and the long arms support a really wide range of movement. With this range of movement, these long arms, these flexible joints, primates can climb, they can swing, they can reach, they can engage in all sorts of different kinds of movements. And it's really interesting if we think about the implications of these physical characteristics, because anthropologically, the physical flexibility or the flexibility that's built in to primate skeletons also supports flexibility in primate behaviors. So because they're flexible, they can start to experiment with new ways of moving, which then maybe leads to new ways of feeding or new ways of interacting with their environment. And that openness to variation is super important in human evolution as well. The third key feature of primates has to do with their senses, as well as with dentition or teeth structures. So, primates' sensory systems are really closely tied to their environment. They have, for example, forward facing eyes, and those eyes produce binocular vision, which means overlapping fields of view. This dramatically improves things like depth perception and spatial awareness, which are obviously very helpful if you're jumping between tree branches or, just trying not to fall out of a tree. Their vision is also very sharp and very colorful. In many primates, color vision helps them to detect which fruits are ripe and ready to eat, or which leaves are young and tastier. As vision became more important, primates' sense of smell and hearing generally became less dominant. You can see that in the way that their snouts or their nose area is relatively short compared to other mammals like dogs or horses. Then, with regard to dentition, the arrangement and the different types of teeth that primates have, dentition is also a clue to primates' ecological flexibility. So, what I mean by this is that primates tend to have different types of teeth for different types of eating. One type of tooth for slicing, one type for puncturing, one type that helps them crush food, another that helps them grind food, and so on. And this variety in their teeth supports diversity in primates' diets. They're able to eat things like fruit and leaves, as well as insects, maybe even small animals, seeds, gums, and different primates, they specialize in different combinations of food. The fourth key feature of primates has to do with their life history and the size of their brains. So, with regard to life history, primates tend to kind of go slow compared to many other mammals. They typically have fewer offspring, and they often have those offspring one at a time. They also have much longer periods of infant dependency, meaning the time when the infant is still reliant on its mother for everything. So they have longer periods of that, and they have longer lifespans. They also have very large and complex brains relative to their body size. A larger brain supports obviously more sophisticated problem solving, as well as better memory, enhanced social awareness, but it also means a bigger investment of time and energy in each of their offspring. So this is where the idea of reproductive asymmetry becomes really important, and we'll talk about this more in a later slide. But the basic idea is that primate mothers bear a heavier biological cost for reproduction. They have to spend a period of their lives pregnant, a period of their lives lactating, another period of their lives caring for their children, and their offspring need that care for a longer amount of time than other animals. So you can see they bear that biological cost for being able to reproduce. As a result, primate social systems, how they're organized, they're often organized around female investment and specific strategies that help female primates to offset the cost of reproduction. An important note here as well, so pay attention. As we talk about primates, try to keep at least one eye on humans and ask yourself, how do our long childhoods, complex social lives, and big brains fit into this broader primate pattern? How do we explain the success of primates? There are essentially three hypotheses that help anthropologists not just describe the traits of primates, but actually to answer the question of why primates evolved. Chapter 4 in the Exploring Our World textbook lays out the three major hypotheses that explain the package or the bundle of primate characteristics that we just went over. The first of these hypotheses is the arboreal theory. It's a classic hypothesis, and it suggests that primate characteristics like prehensile tails, grasping hands and feet, forward-facing eyes, flat nails instead of claws, all of these, it suggests, evolved as adaptations to life in the trees. So being arboreal, it requires fine-grained depth perception as well as a secure grip. So the idea is that natural selection favored those traits. Then there's also the visual predation hypothesis. And this is a hypothesis developed by anthropologist Matt Cartmill. And what it does is it sort of complicates the arboreal story. So Cartmill noticed that forward-facing eyes and grasping extremities are also characteristics of predators like cats and owls. And this kind of leads to the visual predation hypothesis, which argues that primate characteristics or traits may have evolved to help early primates hunt insects and small animals, especially in dense undergrowth. So the key here, it wasn't just trees, but actually predation or predator behavior that is visually guided, that helps primates hunt and eat in complex environments. Third, there is the angiosperm theory. It's another hypothesis, and this one ties primate evolution to the rise of flowering plants, otherwise known as angiosperms. The idea here is that as flowering plants spread, they created new resources like nectar and fruits and seeds. Primate traits like grasping hands and really good visual discrimination may have evolved to exploit these small, scattered, colorful food items. So those are the three major hypotheses that help us understand primate evolution and primate success. You don't have to pick a winner. And actually for quiz questions, you should know the basic idea behind each hypothesis and what they're trying to emphasize. But first, notice what they all share. They're all trying to explain how a particular environment shaped this very distinctive bundle or package of primate traits. So now that we know what primates are like, we can start to ask another question. How are different primates related? And this leads us to primate classification and the primate family tree. If you look at the primate classification figure in our textbook's chapter on primates, which I also have up here on the slide, you'll see a Linnaean taxonomy that organizes living primates into major groups. Humans are also placed among the primates. And as you move up from species to order, the categories become more inclusive. There are two major takeaways from this chart. The first is that humans are primates. We've already hinted at this a little bit, but we share the core primate traits: grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, big brains, long lives, etc. The second key takeaway is that humans are apes. More specifically, we belong to the family Hominidae, along with orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos, or AKA the great apes. We'll dig a little deeper into the diversity of this tree in the second half of the lecture. But for now, I want to just pause for a second and give you a chance to connect this material to your own life. So I have here a reflection prompt, and I'd ask all of you to take a few minutes to think through this prompt or write some notes down about it. Just a few sentences will do. So think about one everyday thing that you do with your body. That can be, texting, cooking, driving, playing an instrument, going to the gym, working out, whatever. So think about that everyday thing that you do with your body, and which primate-like traits do you think that activity depends on? For example, you might think about grasping your phone, opposable thumbs for typing, depth perception for something like driving your car, long learning periods. And once you've thought of those traits, I also want you to think about this. How does seeing that activity, that everyday thing that you do with your body, as a primate adaptation, how does that change the way you think about it? Think also about the specifics. If using my phone was what you thought of, consider what your hands, eyes, and brain are doing when you use your phone. Is there any part of using a phone that a non-human primate would struggle with? Food for thought. Take a few minutes and jot down your ideas, and I'll pause for a second before moving on to the next slide. Okay, hopefully that gave you enough time, or you were able to pause and jot some notes down. Now I want to switch gears to talk a little bit about primate diversity, ecology, and social life. So we're going to zoom out and look at living primates in all of their variety. Hopefully, this section will help you with the parts of the quiz that ask you to distinguish different primate groups and connect their behavior to their ecology and social systems. Chapter 4 in the Exploring Our World textbook, or the Primates chapter, is organized around 3 main themes. The first is about living primate characteristics. The second is about living primate diversity. And the third is about primate ecology and social behavior. So we've already touched on the first, primate characteristics. Now we're going to be working mostly with the second and the third. So first, living primate diversity. There are over 200 known primate species living today, and they're spread all across Central and South America, as well as Africa and Asia. The chapter of your textbook that you read for this module divides all of these species into 2 major suborders. So we're going to look at each one now. The first is Strepsirrhenes. This group includes lemurs, podos, galagos, and lorises. And they're typically found in tropical Africa, as well as Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia. They have a few key features, which I want to go over. The first is a really strong reliance on smell. And that's reflected in these enlarged nasal passages that they have, and something called a rhinarium, which is a moist pad around the nose, sort of like in dogs and cats as well. In addition to their reliance on smell, they have a tooth comb, which is basically just a specialized set of forward-angled lower teeth that are used for grooming and sometimes as well for feeding. The third key feature is what is called a toilet claw, which is sort of what it sounds like. It's a specialized claw that's on their second toe, and it's used for grooming. Finally, many are nocturnal, and because they're nocturnal, they have a reflective layer in the eyes that enhances their night vision. So if you look at the images on the slide here, as well as the images in your textbook, in particular the ones of ring-tailed lemurs or lorises, you'll see that they have really big eyes and sort of fox-like faces, which are very, very different in their proportions than apes or other types of primates. Okay, so that was Strepsirrhini. Now we get to Haplorhini. Haplorhini are more geographically widespread, and they include many more species. Basically, if we were going to sort of lump all the different Haplorhini together, they would contain three major groups. First would be the tarsiers, then the New World monkeys, and then Old World monkeys, plus apes, and that includes humans. And you can see on the slide, if you want a little image of a tarsier, that's the little guy on the top left. The New World monkeys include monkeys like the one shown on the bottom of the slide, and Old World monkeys are pictured on the top right. Interestingly, within Haplorhines, there are tarsiers. And tarsiers are tiny, they're weird, and they're really important. They're interesting because they don't fit neatly into the more primitive versus more derived categories of Old World versus New World, which is part of why they've kind of bounced around taxonomic debates. For now, they're classified as Haplorhines. They are among the smallest primates. They're only found on islands in Southeast Asia. They're nocturnal as well, with huge eyes, as you can see, that take up a huge proportion of their skull. They can't move their eyes in their sockets, so instead they can rotate their heads about 180 degrees, just like owls. Along with other Haplorhines, including humans, they are unable to synthesize their own vitamin C, which has to be obtained through their diet instead. Tarsiers are useful, or I don't know how useful they are, but they are often used in quizzes in a class like this to test whether you remember that they're Haplorhines, not Strepsirhines, despite seeming, quote, primitive in some ways. Within Haplorhines, there's a key distinction between New World and Old World primates. The New World monkeys, or platyrrhines, are typically found in Central and South America. They often have prehensile tails, so those grasping tails. Sometimes they're fully prehensile, and they're even able to support the entire weight of the animal. Additionally, platyrrhines are often arboreal, and they use their tails as sort of an extra limb that helps them balance and grasp objects. So that's the New World monkeys. But we also have Old World monkeys, apes and humans, or catarrhines. So Old World monkeys are typically found in Africa and Asia, and humans are found globally. They include a few different types of primates. So the first is Cercopithecides. This includes Old World monkeys like baboons, macaques, furvets, and so on. Then there are Hylobates. These are the lesser apes, so gibbons and siamangs. Third, there are hominids. These are the great apes. So think orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, as well as you and me. humans. Recognizing these different groups, Platyrrhini versus Catarrhini, Cercopithecids versus Hylobates versus hominids. It's absolutely fair game for a quiz question, so it's worth taking a second look at your textbook and sort of rehearsing the names to study while you study. All right. Within the apes, we have two major superfamilies. The first is the lesser apes, or Hylobates, and this includes primates like gibbons as well as siamings. These primates are typically smaller bodied, and they're highly arboreal. They love the trees, and they're famous for brachiation, or hand over hand swinging through trees, Tarzan style. So in addition to Hylobates, there are also hominids, and these are the great apes. If Hylobates are the lesser apes, hominids are the great apes. And they include primates like orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, as well as humans. For orangutans, they are mostly solitary, and they are arboreal apes, typically found in Southeast Asia. They have extremely long arms and very strong grasping abilities. Gorillas are different. They are larger bodied. They're mostly terrestrial apes, so not so arboreal or tree bound as orangutans. And they often knuckle walk. If you've ever seen a video of a gorilla walking, they walk on the knuckles of their hands. And they live in social groups that are typically organized around a dominant silverback male, a silverback gorilla. Okay, so that's orangutans and gorillas. Then there are chimpanzees and bonobos. These are our closest living relatives. They show us signs of human evolution in some of their behaviors, like the way that they use tools, as well as in their social behavior, and in certain populations, their cultural traditions. Did you think primates could have culture? Well, we'll come back to that. Okay, so that's orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. Humans are nested inside this last group, not standing apart from it, though. And that's really key in anthropology. It's a key conceptual move. By placing humans inside hominids, anthropologists are decentering human exceptionalism, and they're recognizing our continuity with other primates, even while we also study what is distinctively human. Now, you have a general idea of primate diversity. I want to connect this diversity to ecology and to the social life of primates. So this is where terms from your Module 4 quiz are going to really come in. So the first thing I want to talk about is an activity budget. A primate's activity budget is basically how it spends its time. How much of its time does it spend foraging and feeding? How much of its time does it spend moving, traveling? What about socializing or sleeping? There's an example of an activity budget on the screen here, and you can see that there are some differences between male and female adult primates, and immature primates. For example, female adults, possibly because of reproduction asymmetry and other factors, spend more time having to rest than their male counterparts or immature primates. So that's an activity budget, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And studying these things, these activity budgets, it really helps primatologists see how things like ecology, like the distribution of food or the presence of predators, how that shapes behavior. So let me give you one example, maybe two. In environments where food is scarce, where it's scattered, where it's low quality, primates might spend a lot of time traveling and feeding, with less time for things like rest or social grooming, because they're really focused on traveling or moving to areas where food might be better quality or where it might be more plentiful. And they would spend their time then also eating there. But take the opposite of this example. In an environment that's really food rich, you might see more social time, more grooming, more playing, more coalition building. And that's because the basic survival demands in that food rich environment are a bit less intense. So you can see here how ecology and behavior are really intertwined. Primates also use space in patterned ways, in ways that have, these repeated tendencies. So the first way that primates use space is through the home range. And this is a geographic area that a primate group uses, right? So it's their home range. It's the green area that's shown in the image on the slide. Then within that green space, that home range, primates have a core area. And that's basically the space that they use most often. So think of it sort of like a favorite neighborhood where they eat, where they sleep. And those are the black little dots in the middle of the green larger space. Then within the larger green space, there's a territory. A territory is technically a portion of space that a primate group actively defends against others. And so these are pictured in the image as the red areas. They're slightly bigger than the core area, but less big than the entire home range. Some species, it's worth noting, have overlapping home ranges, but strongly defended core areas. Others do something a little bit different and maintain very clear territorial boundaries and keep their territories separate of each other. All right, a really interesting thing to talk about when it comes to primates is predation, or their predator behavior, and anti-predator behavior. So I want to talk about three different kinds of behaviors or strategies that primates use to kind of mitigate predation risk. And that's their predator behaviors like vigilance, vigilance is an anti-predation behavior. My mistake. So vigilance, alarm calls, and something called mobbing. All right, the kind of underlying rationale here is that all primates, they face the risk of predators or predation from carnivorous mammals, as well as from large birds of prey, and sometimes even from reptiles like snakes. Smaller primates tend to be vulnerable to more predators than larger ones, and this ends up shaping their behavior. So we start to see behaviors in primate groups like vigilance, and that is watchful behavior or sort of surveillance, where primates are looking around in their group to detect danger. Vigilance is super important, but it has a cost. It takes precious time away from other activities like feeding, as well as sleeping, socializing, but it's necessary because it reduces the risk that a primate group will be caught unaware and surprised with an attack. So in addition to vigilance, some primate groups use alarm calls. And these are vocalizations that are used to alert others in their group to a predator's presence, and sometimes even to signal the type of predator, like maybe a different sound for eagles versus leopards versus snakes. The third behavior that I wanted to mention to you is called mobbing. And that is the coordinated harassment or attack on a predator by multiple individuals in a primate group. So this is where the primates kind of team up often in ways that are very noisy, in these sort of dramatic displays that are meant to drive the predator away or, at the very least, distract it. Snakes, in particular, they are very common targets for mobbing. Important note, when primates live in groups, you can see how they sort of share the cost of some of these behaviors, like vigilance. Because they live in a group, they're able to split up roles. So maybe some are scanning for danger while others are eating or resting. They take turns. And this is one of the real benefits of group living that, will likely show up in concept reviews or quizzes. So just take a note of it, the benefits of group living. Most primates live in relatively stable social groups. And those range from sort of solitary individuals to pair-bonded pairs to large multi-male, multi-female groups. And like we've said, group living brings a lot of benefits to primates. It's safer, right? Among other things. But it also has costs. So let's review what those benefits and costs, at least the main ones, really are. For benefits, that includes things like, of course, we just mentioned it, better protection against predators. Group living also gives primates easier access to potential mates and more opportunities for social learning, for cooperation, and coalition building. So those are some really key benefits. But on the other hand, there are costs, and these can include things like increased competition for food, for mates, as well as increased risk of disease. You've got more people living in a community, the risk of contagion increases, as well as social stress that can result from having their social worlds organized hierarchically. It can result from conflict, interpersonal issues, fights, and so on, other kinds of social tensions. Now, I want to return for a second to this concept of reproductive asymmetry. And we've mentioned it before, but in case you forgot or didn't write it down, because of reproductive asymmetry, females usually end up bearing greater biological costs. They have to spend a chunk of their lives doing the things that are required for their role in reproduction. So pregnancy, lactation, long-term infant care. And this reproductive asymmetry, it often leads to females being a lot more selective about their mates and to social structures that are organized around philopatry, who stays and who leaves at sexual maturity. That's what philopatry is. For example, in female philopatry, females stay in their natal group, the group where they were born, and males disperse when they are sexually mature. In a male philopatry, the males would stay upon reaching sexual maturity, and the females would then leave. These patterns are really, really crucial, and your textbook goes into them in more detail, so I would suggest that you take a second look at this part of the textbook where reproductive asymmetry and philopatry are discussed. But suffice to say for the moment that these patterns in who stays and who leaves, they're really crucial for understanding things like kinship and alliances, as well as dominance hierarchies in primate societies. And that leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is dominance and the social structure of primates. So let's talk about that. A dominance hierarchy, which is a term I just mentioned, is a ranked system where all the individuals in that system, they know who they outrank and who outranks them. They know who's higher or lower in that hierarchy. So dominance in a dominance hierarchy can influence things like access to food, as well as to mates, and getting support in conflicts. At the same time as their social organization often relies on hierarchy, primate groups also show a bunch of different affiliative behaviors, which are things that are used to reinforce social bonds and reduce the tension that can come with living in a hierarchical society. So affiliative behaviors, and these are things like grooming, playing, resting together, all of the things that reinforce primates' social connections and the bonds that they have with each other. Again, I want you to think about the human parallels of this. Who stays in the family once the kids grow up? Who moves away? Who goes off to college? Who goes off to work? How do hierarchies and alliances form within human families? And how do families deal with conflict? How does conflict coexist with affection in a human family? Right? Because we see so many parallels with primates and their social structures. Next, I want to mention communication and culture in primates. So we'll start with communication. Primates communicate in many different ways, from vocalizations to visual signs to smells. So I want to go over each of those in a little bit of detail, at least to tell you what they include. Vocalizations are what they sound like. They include things like we've talked about before, like alarm calls, as well as contact calls, calls that signal food, etc. Then primates also use visual signals. They use their facial expressions and the posture of their bodies, as well as sometimes very dramatic displays. Finally, olfactory signals play a really important role in primate communication as well. So things like scent marking in some species. That plays a massive role in the so-called culture of primates. The textbook, it asks you to think about the similarities between communication in primates and in humans. Another quick hint for you, this is likely a theme for a quiz. One of the most fascinating parts of chapter 4 in your textbook is the section on cultural traditions in primates. And what we mean by cultural traditions are basically behaviors that are learned instead of being genetically hardwired, are shared by multiple individuals in a group, and persist over time and even across generations. So some examples of cultural traditions include things like tool use among chimpanzees. So in some populations, chimps, they strip leaves off of sticks to, quote, fish for termites, right? Just like they are one is in the picture on the slide. He's taken a stick, stripped off the leaves so that he can stick it inside that tree and fish out food. So fishing for termites. Chimpanzees have also been shown to use stones to crack nuts. Different groups, interestingly, have different repertoires of tools that they use and things that they use them for, which ultimately suggests that some primates have local cultures or cultures that are specific to their local group. Then there's also the case of the Japanese macaques. The Japanese macaques have been shown to wash sweet potatoes. So on Kashima Island, in particular, a juvenile female named Imo, I'm not sure the pronunciation, she began washing these muddy sweet potatoes in water. And over about 30 years, this behavior started to spread through her group, and it even evolved. Eventually, the other primates in her group started dipping potatoes in seawater Maybe, at least some people think, to add salt to them, make them a little bit tastier. The same macaques also learned to bathe in hot springs in snowy regions, initially to go get apples that were thrown in by researchers, but later they learned they could use the springs just to stay warm. Young macaques now play and swim in those hot springs. They caught on. So some primatologists debate whether these examples, the examples of chimp tool use or the macaques washing their sweet potatoes, whether those examples count as full culture. This is a debate, an ongoing debate. But at the very least, I think we can say that these examples, regardless of whether they are full culture, they clearly show invention and social transmission and long-term persistence, which are ultimately hallmarks of cultural processes. Anthropologically, this pushes us to question anthropomorphism. Anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the idea that only humans have meaningful culture. If other primates show cultural variation, then turns out that culture might be more of a spectrum rather than a human exclusive trait, right? It's an interesting thought and one I'd like you to ponder. But before pondering and before we close, I just want to take a second so that you notice how this chapter of your textbook and this lecture align with some of the larger learning outcomes in our course. So first, you've seen scientific methods in action here: field, lab, semi-free ranging studies. Second, you can explain how primates help us understand human origins and human variation, our place in the primate order, our shared traits, and maybe even also our unique ones. You've also connected biology, behavior, and environment, all of which are classic anthropological concerns that link the biological side of anthropology to the cultural side. You've seen how anthropology draws from multiple disciplines. In the case of primates, we can't understand much without also consulting evolutionary biology. Ecology, something we talked about, as well as psychology and other disciplines. They all help us understand primates. And finally, you've touched on how primate research can contribute to contemporary issues. Maybe something like animal conservation, or even a debate about animal intelligence and culture, like we just had when thinking about tool use. All of this, it feeds directly into what you'll be asked to do in future quizzes, as well as in your response papers and later modules. Before closing, I have another reflection prompt for you. So I would love it if you could take a few minutes to respond to this prompt, whether on notes or in your head, after I'm done speaking. And so please pause the video after I'm done talking. Give yourself a second before moving to the last slide. And here's the prompt. Imagine you're explaining to a friend why an anthropology class about humans spends a whole week on primates. In your own words, how would you answer the question, what can we learn about being human by studying non-human primates? Try to use at least 2 specific ideas from today's lecture. These could be about primate traits like binocular vision or life history, could be about social systems like dominance hierarchies or philanthropy, or could be about cultural traditions like tool use or washing sweet potatoes. Encourage yourself to be concrete. The more specific you are now, the easier it's going to be to retrieve this material for different quizzes and for the writing assignments that you'll have in this course. So I'm going to pause now for a few seconds and let you think or write. Okay, everyone. So that's our tour through defining primate relationships. Next time, we'll keep building on this by thinking about human evolution and early hominids. So please hold on to your primate vocabulary. And in the meantime, I really recommend flipping back through the figures, the images in chapter 4, especially the primate family tree and the geographic distribution map. These will help you study for the quiz and the exams coming up. So thanks for hanging in there with all the names and the terms. You are officially better at thinking like a primate and like an anthropologist. Thanks, guys.